Hi, I'm Jason Gover for ThatShelf.com, and we're here to talk about MLK FBI, Sam Pollard's extraordinary documentary about Martin Luther King and the interactions he had with J. Edgar Hoover's Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sam Pollard's had a really interesting career, actually. He's a producer, he's an editor, he worked with Spike Lee on many films. I guess he was last at the Toronto International Film Festival with the Sammy Davis Jr. documentary. And here he does something really fascinating. The film actually starts with questioning whether the film should even exist. That's the very straightforward ethical question that has no straightforward answer, which is the FBI did some pretty appalling things to actually follow and record all these elements about Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. Should we historically benefit from these really appalling and frankly probably in many ways illegal ruses that the FBI did to actually capture some of these elements about his private life? Should we take advantage that the information exists and use it to create a more rich and textured and layered version of this iconic civil rights leader's life? Or is the very act of us taking this information somehow complicit in the original investigations that the FBI engaged in? Should us knowing this information, which was gained through means that were improper, somehow making us part of the story as we tell the story? It's really fascinating and philosophically rich, and the film wrestles with it. It doesn't pretend to have an answer, other than the fact that yes, it's discussing but the details that are uncovered, but it does so in a way which is actually, in some ways, both frustrating and fascinating. That it does not go into the salacious details, other than talking about them with a sort of an intellectual curiosity, but not this sort of deep and sordid tabloidy dive the way that I think many people and many films would. The fact of the matter is Martin Luther King Jr. was a complicated dude. He, on the one hand, was this incredibly eloquent, very vivacious, incredible human being who drove hundreds, millions of people in order to make the world a better place. He was also apparently a bit of a schmuck, especially with his treatment of women outside of his marriage. And that's what the FBI actually was documenting as in the hopes of actually bringing down his legacy. That was their sort of modus operandi, was to control his messaging in some ways, to use it as a form of either blackmail or certainly a form of coercion in order to use this aspect of his life, which especially back then would have completely destroyed what was sort of going on in terms of movement, because it would have been seen as the grand hypocrisy. Who are you to tell us how to be when you have treated these people so badly, when you engaged in such illicit affair? That discussion is still going to continue. And the fact of the matter is, that is, I believe, and the film makes a very strong argument to say, is that discussion in some ways makes him and reminds us that this was a human being. One with frailties, one with weaknesses. We put up statues to him because of the actions that he did. We do not underline those actions by the other things that he did, which frankly shape and color his character. And that's a very fine line to discuss, particularly now, particularly when things want to be very regimented. Our good guys, we want to be good, and our bad guys, we want to be bad. And that's kind of the way that certainly social media activism works, but even the way that the right wing has sort of taken this, like, well, you know, you want this to be good, but what about this and what about this, as if they're weaponizing their own bad behaviors by pointing to someone else and saying, well, this person who is speaking very well and from very good motivations is somehow diminished by these things which may or may not be minor depending on your perspective that you're coming from. This is what the film actually focuses on. So this is a historical interview, a very fascinating historical interview, with the challenge that when the case files are actually open up in actually just a few years, how much that's going to shape our perception of this truly iconic person in the United States, that they have a day that they've given to celebrate. Obviously, you're not celebrating just the man, you're celebrating the ideas behind the man. You're celebrating what he stood for, and what he stood for is above and beyond this. And I think it's very fair to have those conversations with people who are able to hold these multiple ideas in their heads at once, who are able to ride the nuance, who are able to see that this very flawed and very remarkable individual had these many aspects about their life. And I think the film is in many ways quite fearless in recognizing its fears. It is quite sobering in recognizing that we don't have all the answers, and we don't have ways of neatly compartmentalizing even our most heroic of citizenry. And in some ways, that is a greater and more elevated view of humanity than we often get. The fact of the matter is, by even asking these questions of somebody who's almost unimpeachable, like a Martin Luther King, it really makes it quite extraordinary film, I think, in that way, of actually making us seek out hard answers for even harder questions. Same thing takes place with the FBI, the actions of the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover is no nice guy in this. But in some ways, it's not that you can find justification, but you certainly, on a more overt way, understand the mechanisms that were taking place. This wasn't coming in a vacuum either. This was coming out of very systemic processes to actually keep the status quo. It actually speaks to not just racism broadly, but a very specific type of power play, a specific way that governments throughout different administrations have of maintaining a sense of order. And any disruption of that order, be it economic, be it social, be it in forms of justice, inevitably has counterreactions. And this counterreaction, just because we can understand where it comes from, doesn't make it any more or less deplorable, doesn't make it any more against the visions of what the FBI was supposed to be doing. So in the same ways that we can find these minor, or in some ways, I mean, some of the allegations quite appalling hypocrisies of Martin Luther King, we can see that any notion that the FBI was just doing this out of a sense of justice is laid bare immediately, and that we can clearly see the sort of motivations at play here. And again, the hardest question asked of the FBI of all: if you're spending all this time and all these resources and all this manpower following this guy, of knowing his every move, of tapping his phones, of taking a sexual tryst and sending letters to his family. If you're doing all this, how are you so goddamn incompetent that you actually allowed him to be shot by somebody from a hotel room across the road? It's not a conspiratorial thing to point that out. It shows just how laid bare the general incompetence and perfidy of the whole situation is. So I think that MLK, FBI, I almost said JFK, MLK, FBI really lays bare lots and lots of notions that continue to resonate, very much so in today's conversations. Even at its most appalling, we want to have very simple answers. This person is a victim, this person is the victimizer. This is an institution which is meant to help us. This is an institution being corrupted. And the fact of the matter is, so much of this has to do with navigating these various poles, and inevitably, whichever perspective you come from, you're going to overlook some things and focus on others, and we're going to make sort of moral and ethical choices about what's to support. Some will simply claim it under the guise of, well, there's a right way and a wrong way, and that's even more in some ways dogmatic and than anything else being shaped here. In other words, this is deep and heady stuff, and the fact that this is a documentary unafraid to bring us to this point of being able to ask these questions, particularly during this time, which has seen tremendous both political machinations and justified social unrest, and the co-option of that social unrest by those looking, frankly, for some sort of anarchistic response. All of this comes to play, making a film of the history incredibly of the present. And just as we can question how things actually took place 60 years ago, we can begin if we have the sort of intellectual fortitude to do it, to sort of look beyond even our own prejudices and our own views, whatever perspective and element that we actually come from, and see how these things are shaped and how these different nuances often get sort of rounded off as we are looking for something much easier and much clearer for us to actually hold on to. All that from a documentary which is beautifully done, exquisitely edited, and really beautifully put together. A bunch of voices that come on and then have this sort of postscript that again follows up with directly questioning, is our very asking of these questions somehow contributing to some of the challenges and pains that are described in this film. Super fascinating, super interesting film. That's MLK FBI, played at Toronto International Film Festival. Yet another extraordinary documentary at this festival, which has been home to some of the best nonfiction films ever made. For thatshelf.com, I'm Jason Gorber. Please follow us on social media. Please subscribe. Please leave us some comments in the notes below, and we will see you next film. All the best. Take care.